to this breakout session, and I think what is a fantastic first ever virtual Fabian conference. And many thanks to Andrew and Katie and all their colleagues from the Fabian side for putting this on. Thank you so much. This session is called "Standing Up for the Country: What's the Left's Agenda for Defence and Security?" And I'm really pleased today to be joined by John Healey MP, my good friend, who's the Shadow Defence Secretary. Malcolm Chalmers, we hope is going to be joining us shortly, is the Deputy General Secretary of RUSI. Sarah Church, who is a councillor in Swindon, a former parliamentary candidate, and runs Labour Friends of the Forces, and was a former soldier herself. And Paul Mason, the journalist and author. So I'm delighted. We've got a great panel today. So I'm delighted they're going to be here. I'm going to ask each of the speakers in turn to say a few words to us all. I'm going to ask John first, then Sarah, then Paul, and then finally Malcolm. And then we'll take questions from colleagues who are actually on the line. If you're going to ask a question, you'll see down the side the question mark bar there on the left-hand side. You put your question in there, and I then will read the question out, and we'll go around the panel. So if everybody's happy with that, I'm going to ask John to speak to us first of all. So when you're ready, John, if you're happy to do that, Shadow Defence Secretary John Healey.
Roy, many thanks indeed, and big thanks, like you've said, to the Fabians, especially for making this one of the prime sessions of the conference. Couple of reflections first, then one or two points perhaps to contribute to kicking off the discussion. The first is a reflection really for me as I took up this brief 6 or 7 months ago, which is that defence has always been difficult for Labour, and our party members are always happier talking about housing or the NHS or education. It's also hard and difficult for Labour because we've got the two strands of a Labour tradition. First, the sort of historic pride in the armed forces and the fact that some of our biggest figures in history, from Attlee to Healey and Benn, have all served in uniform. And we've got that long-term Labour wing, which is essentially pacifist in many of the arguments that it makes. And as we look at this Fabian conference, the three questions that have been posed to us as the basis for this session and discussion, I think hit to the heart of the challenge that we face now. So in a period essentially of rapidly evolving and escalating threats to the country, most of them invisible now, how does the left, how do we as Labour find a voice, develop a vision and express our values in a way that blends both that concern for, if you like, the security of Britain and the pride in our armed forces with our long-standing commitment to international law, to human rights, and to being a force for good in the wider world. And above all, and this is my main concern as Shadow Defence Secretary, the test for this is not, does our approach get support at Labour Party conference, but does it convince the British people? Now, look, you've got three other very good speakers with a real depth of experience and technical expertise on the panel. So I'm going to make 3 points, largely political, as my contribution. First, on Labour. Bluntly, we will not win government again when almost half the population say that Labour is unpatriotic and doesn't believe in Britain. That was our position as we went into that last election, when 2/5 of the country also thought Labour would not keep the UK safe from terror and other threats. So in December 2019, we had a gap, a deficit, if you like. We were 24 points behind the Tories on defence and security. That was worse even than on the economy. And a number of you on this call at this session will have been on the doorsteps like me in that election. And the hardest doors to knock were those with Help for Heroes or British Legion stickers in the windows. And I say this to parliamentary colleagues who may think, well, look, change your leadership, change your fortune, level pegging in the top line opinion polls. It was 24 points deficit in December 2019 on defence and security for Labour. It's now still 21 points. In other words, the damage and distrust of Labour on defence and security runs deep, and it's long term. That's the scale of the challenge that we face. A national challenge, yes, for us, leading for the party nationally, and those of us involved in the debate nationally, but with local consequences. So there are a number of marginal seats where the number of veterans of working age, never mind the older age former forces pensioners, the number of working age veterans is bigger than the Tory majority in those marginal seats. So I want Labour again to be able to speak for the squaddies. I want us to become again a voice for the thousands of working class men and women who join the services and serve in uniform. And I want us to be able to champion the forces again and their families. So that's why Keir and I have relaunched Labour Friends of the Forces, and Sarah Church is now co-chairing this with our Shadow Defence Minister, Stephen Morgan. We've built up a network now of the Armed Forces champions on Labour councils throughout England and Wales. We've, in the last week, pledged to right the injustice for Commonwealth veterans who have to pay twice over and a big fee if they want to become British citizens. And finally, we will campaign for the Armed Forces Covenant, for instance, to be put into law when we deal with the Armed Forces Bill in the Commons and Lords in the months ahead. So that's Labour. Second, Tories. You can't help, if you're sitting in the House of Commons or hearing them on the media, just be struck by that easy confidence that the Tories tend to have when they speak about defence, and how so often that crosses the boundary into bombast as well. And in truth, their record really doesn't justify that sort of complacency, and it should give us much stronger grounds to challenge Tory ministers than we've been able to mount in recent years. So since 2010, essentially there's been a decade of decline in defence under the Tories. Boris Johnson himself has admitted and called the era of decline. So broken promises to the armed forces over pay, broken pledges to the forces over numbers, with a cut by a quarter and still 12,000 short of the strength that is needed at present, and a crisis in morale. So almost 2/3 are dissatisfied with forces life, and 1 in 4 say they are thinking about leaving before the end of their contract. Secondly, on funding, despite the boast that we had from Philip Hammond back in 2012, they balanced the defence budget. The defence equipment budget now has a 17 billion black hole. Fewer than 1 in 6 of the major projects they're responsible for likely to be delivered on time. And despite that big boost that the Prime Minister made to capital spending for the defence forces over the next 4 years, at the same time, which they've not been willing to concede, Ben Wallace has caved into the Treasury and agreed a real terms cut in revenue funding over the next 4 years. So that is a cut to the funding available for recruitment, for training, for pay, for pensions, for support to the armed forces. So there's plenty that we can mount as an attack on the Tory ministers. And I see in the next 12 months as probably the most decisive for the direction of British foreign policy, defence, security since 1997. And it's an opportunity for us both to hold the Tories hard to account, but make our decisive and distinctive Labour contribution to that national debate. And finally, the bigger political picture, which the others I know on the panel will want to develop. For me, the most essential thing to a starting point is that the distinction that we've frankly all grown up with between peace and law and war no longer applies. And we're in a state of, as a country, continuous conflict, attack, threat, that you'll hear military and policy experts describe as continuous competition. Secondly, as part of that, what's happened is that our adversaries, particularly Russia, China, have studied the weaknesses that are inherent in a country like ours, open democratic trading, and they become much more assertive at exploiting those in what's called in policy terms now grey zone conflict. That's below the threshold of declared conflict or war. It's beyond the realms of traditional military action or deployment. It's using tactics, it's using technologies of cyber, information, space, artificial intelligence, proxy groups often, economic and fiscal attacks, the use of organized and the links to organized crime as well. So this demands of us, and it demands of us as the left, to be able to develop an understanding and a voice which recognizes that we need a greater, broader, more integrated approach to defense and deterrence, that we need to see our military capabilities and technologies at the heart of a much bigger defense and security national effort, and that we've got to see a recasting of the relationship between civil and military society. And at the heart of this, both Keir and I have made very clear that we see defence as the number one duty of any government, which is why we backed the increase in the funding for defence and security over the next 4 years. And we set out with the challenge that we'll need help from all of you and more widely to do, which is to see that Labour can again develop an authoritative voice on defence and security, capable of carrying the party, but most importantly, capable of convincing the country as part of making us fit again for government.
Thank you, John. That's great. And I think we'll come to questions when everyone has spoken. I'd now like to ask Sarah Church to address us. Sarah is a Labour councillor in Swindon.
Actually, Roy, I'm not a councillor. I was the parliamentary candidate, yes.
I'm so sorry, the notes are on there, sorry. You're a parliamentary candidate both in 2017 and 2019. You remember the GMB. You're also, as you heard, the vice chair, joint chair of Labour Friends of the Forces. And before that, of course, you served as a soldier in the army for 13 years, working, I believe, in communications. So you very fully understand that all the issues are here for us. We'd love to hear your contribution, Sarah.
Okay, thank you so much. And thank you to you and to the Fabians for including me on this very esteemed panel. I think, John has said so much that I would absolutely agree with. I'll try not to be repetitive, but I did want to come to the sort of image problem question first, because this is a difficult one. The truth is we do have a proud history of veterans turned politicians. The fact that, our party's roots are in those same communities, which are the military's recruiting grounds. So why do we have this problem? Well, we have a hill to climb at the moment with regard reconnecting with some of our sort of core communities in working class or so-called red wall seats. And so when we improve our image in those seats, we are hopefully going to be improving our image amongst the military and veteran communities. And it's about trust fundamentally. Voters need to be certain that Labour prioritises national security. And there has been an allowance in the past that various narratives, things you do hear on the doorstep about Labour would disband the military, which, has never been true. But that was allowed to fester for a while as an image. And we didn't speak up adequately against it. I don't think, my lasting sort of experience on the doorstep in 2017 and 2019, and I can thank both Paul and John for coming and door knocking with me on those occasions. When I introduced myself as the Labour candidate and as a veteran, there was surprise. In many cases, it opened up a good conversation. But there was, I could well believe that our points behind, 24 points behind, was what we did experience on the doorstep. And the idea that we can be trusted on defence has to really be authentic, and it has to be something that we portray, not just as candidates or members of the front bench, but I think as members of the party. And so, I think we've slightly fallen into the trap that was set to us on culture wars. The idea that being progressive and patriotic can't be something somehow that's mutually exclusive. It isn't at all. We have an ethos as an outward looking, peaceful, internationalist party. And I think you can hold that as well as pride in your own national identity and achievements without it being a proxy for xenophobia or hawkishness about war. I sort of look back on the London Olympics where we were able to balance that, with being nationally very proud of everything we're about as Brits, without it being part of the right-wing narrative. And I think what does hurt us electorally, if we make people feel bad for feeling proud of their country and treat them with disdain, and that doesn't win any votes at all. I'm really proud to be co-chairing Labour Friends of the Forces with Stephen Morgan on John's team. And we're starting some work, connecting with armed forces communities and veterans. And I sort of want to point out here the real importance actually of our local councillors and the armed forces champions. They're really central to that. Putting sort of real force behind the Armed Forces Covenant is extremely important. So that's it's an excellent policy of ours, and we need to retain it, because the delivery of services that really impact people's lives, like school admissions and local housing provision, that's really important to veterans and serving personnel, and it's local councillors and local Labour representatives who help to do that. And we do have the edge on people-centred policy, and we need to build on that and make people really aware that we're the ones that do those things. We as a party aren't just clapping for key workers, we're actually planning to resource them properly, and that includes the armed forces. I'm really grateful for that article that you and Nick wrote, John, in support of those Commonwealth veterans. That's been a campaign that various Conservatives have said they support, but it's about actually putting your money where your mouth is when it comes to supporting the armed forces, and that's where I think we can start to step apart. So on the wider sort of defence front, basically the Shadow Defence team and leadership, they need to come across as trustworthy custodians of the nation's safety. I think that the work that's going on now is absolutely going in the right direction. It's a mixture of personal trustworthiness and credible party policy. But national security, John's talked about this, it's not just bombs and bullets in the 21st century. I think coronavirus is a national security issue. I think, climate change is a national security issue. The rise of domestic right-wing extremism is a national security issue. And I'm sure we'll get onto the integrated review and things, and I think the idea of one of those is very, very good. I was disappointed that the Home Office isn't part of it, because national security, the idea that defence and security happens over there and not here is incorrect. And so I think if we are more joined up, as we can again step apart from the Conservatives. I think that there's really legitimate debate, and John talked about the sort of two strands in our party. There's really legitimate political debate to be had around the utility, morality, and desirability of the deployment of lethal force in any operational setting. I don't think that's an unpatriotic thing to do. I think it's an entirely legitimate thing to do, and I think when we're confident in ourselves that we don't have to ape the Tories. We're our own people on the left, and we believe in an internationalist, peaceful world. But we do believe that the existence of the armed forces is necessary to defend that. So I think that we do well when we're evidence-led. That's definitely how we're approaching, PMQs and so on at the moment. That evidence-led, it helps make our case. When we are integrating our, we're looking at just seeing Nick and John stand next to each other in a way that I haven't seen the Conservatives have a properly integrated conversation is really sort of heartening. And about defence spending, there's a big open goal here, because the Tories do not have a plan. There is no coherence to the way it's about headlines. It's about, we're going to go for this big number, we're going to go for a big piece of equipment. But the reality of cutting revenue spend has the impact on the soldier, the airman, or the sailor, on a day-to-day basis, because that's his pay, that's his housing or hers housing, that's recruitment, that's training, and so on. So I feel that there is huge scope for us to set ourselves apart, actually by doing what we do and having the confidence in ourselves that we have our own approach to defence and security. And I'll leave that there, Roy.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I agree with all those comments very much. And I remember knocking on doors in Bradford South in 2017 and 2019 and meeting the sort of veterans you talked about, and you could have a good conversation. But of course, their first reaction was as you outlined. Right, and I'd like to ask Paul Mason to speak to us. Paul is well known to us all. He's a journalist, and we've seen him on television and done lots of work. He has in the past been the culture and digital editor for Channel 4 News. He then became the programme's economics editor, and he's also held that same position for BBC Two's Newsnight programme. And we're delighted to have you here, Paul. You're always very welcome in our events. Thank you so much. I'll hand over to you, Paul.
Thank you. And can I just say, Malcolm is now back in the room with us, and I was hoping that Malcolm would speak quite a bit about the integrated review. I'll try and say something in case we can't get him on. So I want to just go into this thing. Why does Labour have a problem on defence? Because we do have strong rival, legitimate traditions inside the Labour movement on that issue, and it isn't just pacifism. Some large numbers of our members want to scrap nuclear weapons unilaterally. There is anti-imperialism, so various communities within Britain regard certain things that this country has done historically as illegitimate, one of them being the intervention in Northern Ireland. We have a strong tradition, I should say, also of Atlanticist interventionism, which I certainly wouldn't be part of, but we have to recognise that these traditions are legitimate. And the task of leadership is not to organise some kind of truce between them, or still less, every time one of them's become dominant, bad things have happened. The Iraq War, and then the whole Skripal debacle under Jeremy. The task of leadership is to offer a social democratic internationalist alternative, and then what? Let's be quite frank. You then have to argue for it. This is not something that's going to be sorted out by shutting down branches or banning resolutions. There has to be an argument for a social democratic position. And what is the social democratic position on defence? I think it's this, that we, Labour, intend to run the British state, to modernise it, to enhance the national security of the country by rooting the military and security traditions of the country more deeply in the community and civil society that we represent. Practically, what does that mean? Practically, it means there's a reason why. See, everybody knows what a hospital does. Not many people know what a frigate does. And the reason is that a frigate is supposed to be depoliticized, and you can't easily get on one. But we as a party must interest ourselves just as much into that part of public service and the public infrastructure as we do with the health service. And that's the cultural gap that Keir and John and others, we all have to try and overcome. We have to convince all our members and all our supporters and the movement that we're part of that is not only the route to power, it's the right thing for a social democratic party to do. Now, the integrated review is a good opportunity to do this. It was designed by Johnson and Dominic Cummings as a complete rethink of foreign policy, defence, development aid. What it's turned out to be, as far as I can tell from my sources, is a bit of a mess. It's had to be put on hold because of COVID. Johnson's entire strategy in his head for Britain is a fantasy. That we're going to go out there and become a kind of Clive of India, kind of Sir Francis Drake, mercantilist power. He even said, like Clark Kent, we'll take off our glasses and put our cape on and we'll go around the world doing what? Opening up markets. That's what Johnson said. Well, we've had a year of markets closing down. The problem is, Johnson has rhetoric and he has a faulty hairdryer, but he doesn't have anything in his head about how British defence and security policy can be structured. Now, I think this morning we heard from Keir Starmer the beginnings of something. The beginnings, actually, of something that in the sector is called grand strategy. And what Keir said is that the UK has to be a bridge between America and Europe. The problem is that's not so easy to translate into defence policy, because the critical question in defence, and if Malcolm comes on, there's a brilliant pamphlet that Rusi has produced called Decision Points, which goes through these issues bit by bit. The problem with is that defence asks you, which way on the bridge are you looking? And it means practically, does the British military command and control system mirror that and map onto that of the Pentagon, or does it more easily coexist with our NATO European allies, which is who are less technologically advanced? That's not a question that is answered by saying we want to be a bridge between America and Europe. One of the problems, see, in Keir's speech, the assumption is Biden's in power, that's great. I don't make that assumption. I make the assumption that because Trump threatened to walk away from NATO in 2018, there could be another Trump. And so long-term defense and security thinking has to ask a serious question for Britain. Do we want to be sovereign in the sense that able to deploy our capabilities irrespective of what the Americans are doing? We have another problem. Europe is not standing still. President Macron is obsessed with the idea of strategic autonomy for Europe. So that means a separate GPS system, a separate 5G system, separate command structure, separate from NATO, albeit alongside. No, that's not solved either. So the Tories will have real problems answering a lot of this, especially as we're now 100% of debt of GDP in debt. Money will have to come from somewhere. Let me throw in two ideas that I think are interesting and important for us. We as a movement we have no business dictating technological solutions really to experts in the military field and security. We do have an interest in communicating to our members and the civil society we're part of what is the threat. The threat is not just Russian hybrid warfare, or grey zone as you call it, John. It's not just Chinese soft power and a China that does intend to shut down parts of the sea to other countries. It's not just that. It's not just the proxy war that's being stoked up in the Eastern Mediterranean. The threat is to our country that the multilateral system breaks down. And if it does, we're in quite a bit of trouble, because if you move straight to great power politics, America is a great power, China is the rising great power, on the edge of Europe is Russia. Europe will have to become a player, otherwise it's just a chessboard. And this is why Macron is right. Where do we sit if all that happens is the strategic question that should be at the center of the IR, and hedging our bets in terms of force structure and in terms of technologies should be, I think it's a legitimate thing to do, although there are costs associated with it. I want to finally say, again, in case Malcolm doesn't get on, that what is front of mind for most people in the thinking space that we're talking about is what just happened in Nagorno-Karabakh. A small war in a place most people can't even spot on the map. What happened was that a second-rate former Warsaw Pact army defeated a NATO-trained army, and according to one document that is doing the rounds, the Azeris, using very cheap and basic technology provided to them by the Israelis and the Turks, destroyed a tank force bigger than the entire British Army's tank force. No, they also destroyed its entire logistics and its entire air defense. What does that mean? It means, and the Armenians, if you've ever met them, are not givers up. They're not quitters. They are not people who are emotionally uninvolved. They are the opposite. But they lost their will to fight because their army was being destroyed. Most people, the Russians, the British military, the Americans, are now looking at that very carefully. Why does it concern us? Because it doesn't just concern, let's buy some drones. Of course, we need to probably buy some drones. It raises the question, is the British armoured capability defensible from that kind of thing if the Russians got hold of it? And they do have most of it anyway. It then raises the question, where do you buy the drones from? How do you create a capability in this country to make and remake them and improve them? And above all, on what GPS system do they operate? So these are the big questions that all tier one military powers are facing. They are political questions at the point where you're deciding what the future strategy of your country is to maintain national security. And I think these are entirely legitimate things for John and his team to be going into the next 3 months, saying to Boris Johnson, you didn't invite us in. We've not been invited into the IR. We weren't given, bipartisan access to this process, but now it's there. Our job is to, in its own terms, say, does it make sense? Are these decisions right? Or, as I expect, because if they can screw up COVID, they can screw up the 25-year forward planning for the British military. Are they a series of short-term, ill-advised, vested interest, money-driven, and individual service rivalry-driven decisions? Those are where I think if we can establish competence as a party on those questions, then, and Sarah, it's not just about us representing veterans and ordinary servicemen and women. We need to be in a dialogue with the people in the Defence Academy, with the people in RUSI, to make clear that we have a competence and a view on all these questions, which unfortunately I think just did not happen, not just under Jeremy, but for quite a long time actually, since Blair went. We didn't have a function in Labour saying, here's what we think. And I think we've got the basics of it here, so let's take it forward.
Thank you very much, Paul Lotz, for us to get into there. Now I'm going to move to questions now. If colleagues want to ask questions, you'll see on the left-hand side, there's a little question mark. That's the place to put your questions in. And I then will, of course, read them out. And I'm going to get as many as I can in the next 20 minutes. And then I'll leave a couple of minutes then at the end for each of the speakers to just say a few words. I'm going to start off with the first question I can see here, and I'm going to go to Sarah to answer this question first of all, because it's very relevant. The question is, and it says by anonymous, I don't know who's actually asking the question, but it says, do you think Labour needs to do more to recruit veterans to stand as local and parliamentary candidates? And if so, how should we do this? So I'll start with Sarah, then I'll move on the panel.
Okay, thanks, Roy. I mean, the answer is yes. Yes, we do. It needs to be, and if somebody is leaving the forces and interested, or while they're still serving, they might take an active interest in politics. But as they leave, it needs to be, intuitive that they may choose to come to Labour and stand for us as a local or parliamentary candidate. And Labour Friends of the Forces is actively looking at this. I would like to see, a mentoring scheme. I mean, we've got Labour councillors who are veterans who, are doing a fantastic job up and down the country. I mean, we need to. Leaving the military is a cultural shift anyway. It's a quite significant one when you go from leaving the military and come into the party. And oftentimes people may have been a member, but they won't have been very active while they were serving, because it is quite difficult to do that while you're serving. So I just think culturally it needs to be easier, and that path needs to be smoother. And it is something Labour Friends of the Forces and I know Shadow Defence Team are looking at actively. So yes.
Thank you. John, do you want to give your views on this, please?
Short answer is yes. Part of the reason that we've relaunched Labour Friends of the Forces is to breathe fresh life into one of its founding ideas, which is to encourage not just the voices and views of people who have service experience to play a bigger part in the Labour Party, but that we provide the encouragement and practical support to encourage more people with service experience to stand for Labour at local government and I hope into Parliament. So especially with Sarah now there as a co-chair, instead of it just being run by parliamentarians quite tightly from the centre, this is a major mission for that broader network. And just say to people who are on the call, if you have an interest in the forces and armed forces, if you're a Labour Party member, then please do get involved in that network. We've already put an extra 500 members on since the summer, and we're looking to grow it further.
Thank you. And Paul, did you any views on this point as well?
Well, the only thing I would add about getting, it's obviously brilliant if we can get veterans to stand for Labour. I think there's an argument about, there's a discussion to be had about veterans that is more in the context of reserves, because I think one of the things that is going to have to change about the way we think about armed forces careers is the thinking now is there are so many threats, and so much of service life is specialized. If you're doing one job, you're doing a fairly specialized job, that we're going to be able to need an armed force that stands up, does things, and then stands back again. Think about the medics who are coming into, army medics coming back into service with COVID-19. And I think, therefore, another thing we need to think about, apart from saying, yes, please stand for Labour, is also to the ones who don't want to do that, is to say, we want a much better and more intelligently designed post-service life for people who've been in the services. And that I mean, paradoxically, that could mean they don't end up as Labour candidates, because if they're potentially active service people, they might not want to be doing that. So I think that, I just think the design of post-service life needs to be a big thing. And there's another question further on saying, should we have a separate veterans department? The USA has a veterans department, and I think it is worth thinking about that, because it does feel very neglected in British life. I mean, it's an open knowledge that a lot of, even now after we've known about it for 20 years, a lot of people living on the streets are ex-service people.
Thank you. I'm afraid to let the colleagues know we just cannot get Professor Malcolm Chalmers on, so I'm really disappointed. There's just been some issue with the IT getting connected, so I'm disappointed in that. But I'm now going to ask a question from Dr. D. Dutter, and the question is: how will Labour develop foreign policy which has previously used its Five Eyes alliance as a basis for a coherent Western defence policy? However, in the recent times, there's significant differences between how Australia deals with China versus how US deals with China. And could I ask John if you could maybe come in first on that question?
Yeah, thanks, Dee. Look, there's no easy answer to this, but to say to you and to pick up questions that Kathleen and Sophie have also posed, which I think are part of the same territory. There are 7,000 full-timers in the MOD main office. I have 1.5 policy advisors to work with me. It is very hard outside government to make the assessment of the threats that we face, the intelligence that we have to make sense of, and the strategy that needs to be in place. It's one of the reasons why I've been pushing for the early and an end to the delay of the government's integrated review. This will give us some of what we need to open up the terms of debate, make the sort of contributions that Paul Mason has started to talk about today, and to hold the government to account for some of the shortfalls. It's also the opportunity to pick up the points that Sophie makes about being able to say, well, Britain is, and Tory politicians are guilty of overreach, bombast, and unrealism in looking for British forces to be deployed in the Indochina area, for instance, and that actually some of our most serious threats, risks, securities in the next 10 to 20 years mean we have to do much more in the North Atlantic, we have to do more in the High North, we have to pay greater attention to the multiple ways that Russia is challenging us at the moment, and the risks that are still there with proxy groups and terrorist groups as well. And so we will do what we can. One of being in opposition, having served in government, is pants. There is only one potential upside in being in opposition rather than government, and that is you can, with the right understanding of the need to do this and the will, avoid some of the silos that hamstring you in government, where the departments are very rigidly pursuing their own interests, never mind the services pursuing their own interests. So we have within the Shadow Cabinet a working group that is including the Home Office team, looking at this wider question of foreign policy, defence, security, if you like it, almost mirrors the integrated review, and that's medium-term work. In the meantime, we've got to coordinate on the economic side with Annalise Dodds, and that was one of the questions there from Luke Richards. Do we talk? Yes, of course we do. And I've mounted a very strong critique of the funding horizon for defence and security. But we have to do our best in opposition, and we can at least, and we are, looking to try and develop what I described earlier on as a rebooted Labour voice, vision, and expression of our long-standing values for Britain's role in the world, our foreign policy, defence and security future as well.
Thank you. Paul?
Well, look, on the question of, let's be clear about when we hear the words Five Eyes, it's an intelligence alliance going back to the Second World War and the Cold War. Some people in the Tory party see it as a geopolitical alternative to the alliances we already have. So that there are people at the fringes of the Tory party who talk about CANZUK, so Canada, UK, etc., forming some kind of a new common market. Not surprisingly, the common denominator is it's white people. India is never invited to this alliance, for example, nor Jamaica. So we need to be clear that we're not interested in that. But it's true that, as I said in my 6 minutes worth, the big danger of the 21st century is that we end up in a fractured and fragmented great power world. And if we do, then I'm afraid Australia and New Zealand are in the penumbra of China. I mean, they're no more powerful as countries than Vietnam and Korea and Taiwan. I mean, Taiwan has a bigger military than all of them put together. So that's why we need to avoid that world coming about, and that the alternative to it is a multilateral world in which we engage China and bring it to the table as I'm afraid the Americans are going to have to get their heads around this, as an equal competitor, but one that is obeying and adhering to mutually agreed rules. And I think that's how we need our foreign policy needs to approach it. And I noticed while we're on here, there is another question about should the aircraft carrier and a carrier group be steaming around the South China Sea? Well, I think it's important that we demonstrate, if we built a carrier, we should demonstrate its ability to go beyond the Atlantic, yes. But should we, I very much think, and I say this in the spirit of having a debate with those who disagree, that the emphasis of British national security should be focused around Europe, the eastern flank of NATO, and as John says, the North Atlantic and the Arctic. That's enough, actually, for 60 million people with an army of less than 80,000 to be doing. And I've always thought that, but it comes with trade-offs. It does lose you the illusion that is in Boris Johnson's head that we can be a global power. I think we can be a very strong regional partner for Europe and the United States. It's going to be hard enough to fulfill that role.
Thank you. And Sarah?
I'll be brief. I think, I mean, those points are all correct with regard, it comes down to, who are we in the world? And we have to be realistic about that. And I think John's and Paul have both made the point that that's what the Conservatives aren't, is realistic about what global Britain is. I think that Boris Johnson thinks that it's a return to empire in some ways, but we are a small country in a great amount of debt that has given up some of its multilateralism in the recent past. And I think if you asked the man on the street or the woman on the bus what they thought about us sending ships steaming around the world, they might say, why are we doing that? And what in whose interest is that? So, if we can define, in holding at the moment the Conservatives to account, but also in creating our own vision for the future, who we are, what is our national interest, what do we need to do to keep ourselves secure as a country, and have a realistic point of view about who we are. I think that's what we should be doing.
Yeah,
thank you. I think the question from Kathleen actually follows on from this. Her question is, the electorate need reassuring that Labour have a robust understanding of the threat landscape from the immediate to the long term and have a strategy that is agile and robust when needs be. How will this be achieved? And could I maybe ask Paul to comment first on that?
Well, that's a great question, but it's the question that has eluded generations of people much more expert than me. So the electorate does need reassuring, yes, right, that we have a robust understanding of the threat landscape. So let me, in 2 minutes, tell you what I think the threat landscape is. There's still a threat of terror, both homegrown and imported from North Africa and other parts of the world. But I think we have both the intelligence and the reactive policing capability, as we saw in the London Bridge attack, to deal with what we know is out there. That's the sort of urgent, important threat at all times. The strategic threat is Russian hybrid warfare. Russia is led by a man who thinks it's cool to poison his own citizens, whether on his own soil or on ours, with deadly weapons. Some of the people I've been working with, the Belarusian oppositionists, are receiving open death threats from. They live here in London, where I live. I know them. They receive death threats from a government, the Belarusian government. That's the threat. And what is the real problem with that threat? Is that hybrid warfare means it will use organized crime, propaganda, corruption, political influence, and political influence companies to do what? To destabilize our democracy. They don't care. Russia today runs stories in favor of Black Lives Matter here and in America, and in South Africa, it runs stories in favor of racist white farmers. They don't care which side they're on, as long as there is dissent. That is the main threat. And we, with the new integrated operating concept that announced by the Chief of the Defence Staff, Nick Carter, is a good starting point for understanding how to push back against it. Have a look at his speech that he made in September about that. But one of the things we need to do is to not just sort of stand up and beat our chest, yes, we're in favour of meeting the threat, but understand that we are a small country with a big military footprint that only has power when we operate in alliances with people. And it's the alliances that are not that clear at the moment because of the shakiness of America and because of this debate that I alluded to earlier inside Europe about whether Europe should basically become an autonomous sovereign player in geopolitics. If it does, we're just, as you can see, we're not much of a bridge. We're a sort of little satellite, and that's a problem.
Thank you. And Sarah?
Yes, so I think it's easy. It's not easy to forecast what's going to happen, look at the threat landscape really coherently and understand what it all means at the same time. But that is sometimes easier to achieve than getting the capability into place to counter it, to have a strategy that is not just thought through, but actually resourced. And agility in defence and security has always been a problem. For a start, it's a multi-agency problem. So if you're only looking to perhaps domestic security in the police, then agility and the ability to react is good. When you look to integrate that perhaps with other agencies, including the military and whatever arena, that becomes harder. I don't want to get too down in the weeds, but our equipment programs don't match our strategy and the threats, and they certainly can't move fast enough to change in response to those global threats. So we make big commitments to, whether it be naval ships, whether it be aircraft, whatever it might be, we make those big commitments, but we don't say why and what it's for. And I think that's done often in place of actually having a coherent plan, and which is why Keir's move towards a grand strategy is so sort of welcome, in the right direction to go in. But I think that real integration between agencies and showing that we understand what national security is, and then looking at how an equipment program might actually correlate to that would be a good step in the right direction.
And John?
Can't hear
You're
him.
on mute, John.
Sorry, everyone. Look, in the interest of getting more questions in, both Paul and Sarah have made some important points. To some extent, I picked up Kathleen's point earlier on with the recognition of how hard this is in opposition without access to the intelligence, the information, the experts and the technical knowledge that in government you can draw on. So we're inevitably reduced to finding the important reference points that demonstrate our approach would be different without being able to spell out the detail, and demonstrating how that also captures a Labour view of Britain's contribution to the world and the way that we need to operate ourselves. And so I think we can do that. It's a tough challenge, and I'm grateful to some of you in the chat also for making the point that quite rightly we need to be able to draw on those Labour members and supporters who have expertise in the wider world that can help us develop this thinking, as well as make some of the arguments alongside us formally as the Labour Party. We build up our credibility, we build up the authority with which Labour can speak to some extent, to the extent that others are making some of the same arguments. And that's part about leading the arguments. It's partly being able to reflect and draw on the expertise that is there that we can use as well.
Thank you. I'm going to try and get in two more questions. We get some sort of briefer answer. How we get two more in. Could I ask the panel a question from Michael Farmer? What should Labour's policy be towards intelligence and cybersecurity? And that's Mike Farmer, who's in Cheltenham, the home obviously of GCHQ. Paul, have you got a view on that?
Well, look, intelligence, of course, was hugely problematic under the Blair government, and I think all you can do with intelligence is establish governance of it that makes sure you're getting the right stuff properly processed. With cybersecurity, I mean, we need to be level with our members and our movement that the whole of British civil society is a battleground between us and threat actors, whether it's China or whether it's the Russians or whether it's ISIS, and with cybersecurity, what we've now got, it's fairly clear if you read between the lines of Nick Carter's speech. We are moving to a position where we're not just going to sit and take being attacked, cyber attacked, whether it's through disinformation, whether it's through hacking or the rest. We're going to do it back. Though that is where I would hope that even the most kind of blue-blooded Tories are out there, given they're so obsessed with libertarianism at the moment, that we're out there, that politicians do have to police the edges of that. We have to understand that as we move to combating cyber threats inside British civil society with things like 77th Brigade, those institutions will need a lot of scrutiny for the simple fact that we are making a trade-off between our rights and our security. So, I wish we had more time to discuss that actually, and more expert voices on the call, because that is a big thing. It's going on all around you now. It's going on probably in this chat.
And John.
Yeah, in a sense, Paul's made the points. It's not. I don't, to be quite level with you, don't expect to be able to lay out in the next 12 months a detailed Labour prescription on cyber security. What I think we can press the government on is that they've been slow to respond. So the new investment now that they're prepared to make over the next 4 years to beef up the cybersecurity systems and capacity is overdue. The fact that it's only in the last 12 months that the British Army has set up a cyber command is overdue. The fact that, as Paul said, we're starting finally to push back and regard it as legitimate to respond to offensively rather than just defensively to the sort of attacks we've been suffering across the piece for a number of years now is overdue as well. And also to pick apart, in a sense, the evidence that we've got of both the strategy the government will put in place for this, which is still lacking, and I think the point about governance for us as a social democratic left party is something that we can expect the Tory government to neglect, and for us to have an important voice in as well.
Thank you. And Sarah.
In the interest of time, I'll be quick. When it comes to intelligence, I think our policy should be around it being shared and trusted, and that comes back to the governance piece. And on cyber, I think Paul's outlined how it's a whole of society concern. I think a whole of society response is appropriate as well. In the same way that, you know, we all have a responsibility with regard to the threat of coronavirus, we actually all have a responsibility with regard how we respond and share disinformation, etc., etc. So perhaps a look at how you go beyond military and security services to counter some of these threats too.
Thank you. Could do one final quick question, and after that, then I'll ask each of the panelists just again give us a quick 30 seconds to wind up the session. And the last question is from James Chepsey. We did touch on it before. Is asking, do we feel there should be a separate Department of State for Veteran Affairs? I know we've had a Minister for Veterans, I don't know that in the past, but what do we think? And can I ask Sarah, can you maybe give us your quick view on that?
I think in the short term, yes, having a separate function to make sure that we make those civil military connections where perhaps we haven't, where it's been neglected in the past. But ultimately, you want veterans and the military community to be embedded adequately in civil society. That it's a natural function, perhaps for local governments, natural function in normal sort of local community. So short term, yes. Longer term, you'd hope you wouldn't necessarily need to be so specific about it.
And Paul?
Either do that or do what you do with, say, children's services either do that or what you do with children's services in local councils. You make it statutory that local council would have to do certain things for veterans.
That's a very good point. And John?
We will look to do exactly what Paul's just said, which is essentially capture the obligations we should hold as a society to veterans in law by making the Armed Forces Covenant legally binding in the legislation the Tories will introduce over the next few months. I'm less persuaded about the idea of having a Department for Veterans Affairs. Two reasons. One, we tend to operate with a concept of veterans as either desperate, hopeless, and homeless, when actually the vast majority of veterans leave the forces and go on to very successful lives and careers, which is what we want to encourage. And second, as part of that, actually as our armed forces shrink, the proportion and number of veterans, particularly as that generation that had experience of national service passes, is going to get a great deal smaller. I'd like us to consider a much stronger focus on the way that we make our forces a career choice, an opportunity not just for the individual that joins, but for their families, and that we make it a more flexible choice. Because the concept of the use of our reserves and the ability to move in and out of active deployment and service, I think is going to be increasingly important to us for our security, our sort of wider resilience in the longer term. And I feel that the forces, as well as the industrial technologies that are at stake in this, have been for too long conceptualized and organized in a way that is separate from civil and commercial society, in a way that we've got to bring them together. And to Luke Richards, who's saying, look, a whole of society approach is current government policy. Yes, they have the words, Luke, it may be even captured in policy, but in practice, they're very far from doing this. And I think we've got to challenge them on exactly that.
Thank you, John. Just some very quick comments, final comments from the three panelists to wrap the session up. Paul, anything you want to say? Paul seems to come.
Just to go back to the original point, I think we can be positive and confident about addressing the integrated review. It's going to be a mess from the Tory point of view. Nobody's going to be happy. We can make And I want CLPs and Labour councillors and PLP members who are not often, it's the last thing they want to think about, to think carefully and closely about how we do that. It could be we've shown our competence on COVID, even out of power, I think we can do an equal job on the integrated review. Once Boris Johnson comes up with the dog's dinner, it will inevitably be.
Thank you. Sarah?
Just to sort of sum up around the reconnecting with our core communities and building that trust back up, it is a mountain to climb, but I think that the party is going in the right direction, and that when it comes to what I call the open goal on strategy, and also having the confidence and understanding in what capability, human and material, is required in defence and security, is something that we can absolutely have and show our competence on in opposition as well.
Thank you. And finally, John Healy.
First to say, I'm really sorry we couldn't get Malcolm into this discussion. I think everybody would have really appreciated and gained a great deal from that, and I certainly would have done. Look, I think I've got three things. One, I want, over the next 2 to 3 years ahead of the next election, I want Labour to again be capable of being an authoritative voice on defence and security. Second, I want Labour again to be capable of standing up for those personnel and their families who are on the front line in our services. And third, I want to make sure that we support the marginal constituencies where the armed forces and their families, or those workers in the wider defence industry, need to be with us if we're going to win at the next election. And I see, if you want, those 3 points as the marching orders for the shadow defence team. But there is no way that we can do that without being able to pull on the sort of wider support and activity and expertise that some of you on this call in the Labour movement also have. So thanks very much.
Thank you. And I'm bringing the session to a close. Can I thank everybody who's participated in terms of the questions you've asked? It's been great. I thank